Hi, I'm Andy with Line2Line Coatings. I'm going to talk about the Stribeck equation, which governs the oil film and resulting friction between mating parts. This is the Stribeck relationship. This curve here is the oil film thickness. It's actually governed by the viscosity of the oil, the velocity of your sliding parts, and the force which is pushing your parts together. Over here is a very thin oil film and it grows up here. So you pick your parameters defined by your engine usually and determine your oil film thickness, drop down, and then go across to read your friction. Obviously, when you're running out of oil on this side, the friction is climbing quickly. On this side over here, as your oil film gets very thick, the friction is low but climbing because you're stirring more oil. Notice the pattern on the left-hand skirt, which we've all seen on real pistons. There's an area in the center which is heavily loaded and you might see some scratches in there. Then you can see the load tapering off, the wear is reduced, and this is actually a happier spot on the piston. Then as we go out to the edges of the skirt, the barrel shape of the skirt peels away from the bore so much that this area of the skirt actually carries no load, it just stirs extra oil. So let's go back to the Stryback friction curve for our red, yellow, and green squares. Remember, we've got to add up the contribution of each square to get the total friction of the whole skirt. So over here on the APC skirt, we started off, remember, the whole thing was too tight. Especially in this red spot, it would have been really tight. So the red spot wears away. It's abradable. So now that load is spreading and the yellow area actually grows. The load sucked up by the red over here is distributed more evenly across the skirt on the APC piston. Also notice that we're actually eating up green squares with yellow squares, and the yellow squares have a lower friction, so that's a good thing. For the APC skirt, we look again at the Stribeck equation. You can see there is no red arrow. The yellow area got bigger, so anyway, we've got a lot of squares at the yellow minimum friction point. That's a good thing. Also, the green arrow used to be taller over here because the thickness of the oil film was higher. APC is a thick coating, so the oil film is not as thick. Therefore, our green arrow moves a little bit that way on the APC skirt. So to estimate the total friction of a piston skirt, again, we're going to take the number of green squares, multiply it by the length of the green arrow to come up with a value. Then we're going to count up the yellow squares, multiply it by the length of the yellow arrow, get another value. And for the liquid or bare piston, we have to include the red. Adding it all up, you cut the friction in half based on these little estimates. So what that gives you is lower friction and the absolute minimum clearance in your piston bore combination. That takes the secondary motions out. It's a big benefit to a running engine. So if we apply the Stribeck relationship to piston design, everyone starts over here in their bore and they go tighter and tighter and tighter to keep the rings square, and then they get a scuff and they back up. That tightness is only measured at the gauge point though. What APC allows you to do is start the entire piston skirt over here at higher friction, and we go through the controlled wear mechanism with the APC, and naturally the friction slides down, and when the wear stops, look, the whole skirt is pretty much at the minimum friction point on this curve. So let's look at some real pistons for evidence of this Stribeck equation. So these 4 pistons were all in the same engine for 1,500 miles. This is a thin coating. This is a thin coating, this is a thick APC coating, and that's actually a repeat picture of this guy. But you can see that the witness marks show all the load on this skirt was basically in between these lines. So the thicker liquid coating actually spread the load a little bit better, but the APC coating clearly is burnished in through a very large area of the skirt. So we know we're spreading the load like we said before. We know the oil film is thinner in these surrounding areas than it is over here, so the friction is lower. Also, for oil film stability, think of yourself as the little drop of oil that's in the center of this skirt when the load crosses over. Your job is to get out from under that load and squeeze out, and at that point the oil film collapses and your parts can touch, and sure enough, look, there's scratches all over this skirt. This one has some scratches too, you can't see. The migration path is a little bit longer, so it's a little better. However, if you're over here on the APC skirt, you've got to travel way further as the drop of oil to allow this oil film to collapse. So there isn't time for the oil to get out of the way. That's why, even though it's a thinner oil film here, it's a much more stable oil film. So if we consider the Stribeck equation again on these microphotos, notice here it's a rough surface on the as-machined piston with the thin liquid coating on it. This high roughness means you need to have a very thick oil film to ensure that your parts don't touch. Over here on the APC skirt, we have an actually perfectly polished plateau surface carrying the load, full of little oil holes all over it. But the fact that there's no roughness sticking up from those plateaus means that it only takes a very, very thin oil film to ensure that none of those plateaus reach through the oil film to touch the bore. That's why the friction is low and it stays that way. Your parts actually never touch on the APC side. See the scratches? No scratches. So conceptually, if we look at an engine, it's got skirts making friction and it has rings making seal and friction through the life of the engine. The APC skirt is the green line and a standard skirt would be the blue line. We start with a higher friction in the beginning, and over seconds or minutes, perhaps an hour, we achieve a lower friction, and it continues to drop, and it stays that way because of the stable oil film. Over here we have the thicker oil film, the high unit loading in the center of the skirt, and eventually you're going to get a scratch. The scratch dings the ring, and now the ring performance starts to drop. Also in this case, the clearance is larger, so there's more secondary motion, and again, that alone, without a scratch, will cause the ring performance to begin to degrade earlier. So in an APC piston, you have a little higher friction for a couple minutes, you achieve this very tight clearance at very low friction, and that holds everything together and protects the system. The purple line represents the APC ring. Of course, they do continue to wear, just at a slower rate than a standard piston. So in between these lines, the gray area represents fuel economy and performance over the life cycle of your engine. Which would you rather have? Okay, I hope that was fun. And there's other movies on other aspects of APC, so check them out. Thanks a lot.